All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest tonight. It's Lyle Blackburn. Welcome to the show, Lyle.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. It's my pleasure. I'm glad to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to this interview. I'm very curious, as always. I've been on this path with Bigfoot and discovering the answers we're looking for this Bigfoot enigma, if you will. Let's start with the very beginning and sort of tell those that aren't familiar, A, who Lyle Blackburn is and what got you interested in the subject.
Well, I've written 7 books on the subject of cryptids at this point, and I participated in quite a few documentaries by Small Town Monsters. I'm the narrator of those films, and sometimes I'm in them. I've done several television shows, which doesn't qualify me really as a Bigfoot researcher necessarily, but also in doing all of that, I've been in the field for years researching this in terms of what goes in the books and just in my own personal interest in the subject of not just Bigfoot, but other cryptids. This is something that I was fascinated with ever since I was a kid. Early on, I gravitated towards anything having to do with horror or monsters, horror movies. And then I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film. I got a book that had stories about Bigfoot, the Yeti, Loch Ness Monster, and, something clicked. It was like, wow, those, it's one thing to be Frankenstein. I know that's a guy made up in a mask, but these are like quote unquote monsters in real life, something you could encounter. And having grown up hunting with my father, he was an avid bow hunter. I spent a lot of time in the woods. So, I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film and later saw the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, which really did it for me because I live in Texas, and that all happened in Arkansas, just about 3 hours from where I live. So it was kind of like the home thing. And, I just thought, wow, if I'm sitting in the woods and I see something like that, it's going to be scary, but it's exciting at the same time. So that just started me on sort of a lifetime of, reading and researching the subject. And then later on, when I decided I wanted to write a book, I thought, Legend of Boggy Creek, what is the story behind all of that? And I just did it as something really to learn myself, but that kind of launched me into, why I'm on the show, I guess.
Let's talk a little bit about, I want to get into the Legend of Boggy Creek, obviously, but I want to talk a little bit about your process when you go into a subject you're going to write a book about, right? You come up with, hey, I want to explore this. Sort of talk to us a little bit about and let us in on your process as far as the research that you go through and what's your process when you're putting that together for the book itself.
Okay, they're pretty much all similar in the format, where I talk about the history of a particular cryptid or subject in cryptozoology or a location, and then there's historical aspect, there's interview with people, and I also go to the area. That's one thing. I don't just kind of armchair do these things. So for example, in my first book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, I kind of searched and found all the newspaper articles there were on it, from which it first made the newspapers in 1971. So, there were sightings before that, but, I gathered everything was sort of put out in public. Obviously there's a movie about that, so it has a little bit more, but, once I had collected that information, which required me to go to, libraries and search the internet and all that sort of stuff, then I went up to the little town of Falk where all that took place and just kind of started poking around and talking to people, and eventually kind of hooked up with some people who, knew others and kind of had an interest in the subject. And through that, I was able to start interviewing people who either had some connection to the movie or had a sighting, or maybe their mom had a sighting, as well as what I discovered, ongoing sightings. So I was able to first person interview people. And then as part of that, obviously I was fascinated with the movie. So I wanted to go into these bayous and along Boggy Creek and in the bottoms to look at the landscape myself. And by doing that, I kind of insert that into the book, where I bring the reader, what is this environment? Is this even a place where a, small population of cryptids could even exist? So, it was part research in the field in that aspect. And then I kind of brought all that home through several trips, and then, composed the book, which interweaves the story, the backstory, the making of the movie, as well as my experience in those bayous and just the experience of researching. And that pretty much has been, the same kind of format for the rest of my books, where I'll do the same, kind of process.
I've admitted it on the show before. I've never seen The Legend of Boggy Creek. I'm probably the only guy that's into Bigfoot that's never seen that movie. And I actually wanted to watch it before I did this interview, but unfortunately, I just haven't had time. And it's on my bucket list. I may do it this weekend. It's definitely something I want to do. But there may be people out there who aren't familiar with the story. So can you kind of give us the backstory and tell us where the legend of Boggy Creek actually came from? What was the movie based on?
Yeah, and it's something that not every Bigfoot enthusiast has seen, and it was something that was a sensation back in the 70s. So people of a certain age, unless, they saw it, or say their father showed it to them or whatever. I always do at conferences, if I'm doing a presentation, how many people have seen The Legend of Boggy Creek? And usually about half the people raise their hand. Everybody seems to have heard of it, of course. It was a movie that began as a documentary, and back in 1971, stories began to make the newspaper in this area of Texarkana, and that's in southwest Arkansas. And the stories were about a family who had been attacked by this big hairy monster, and people had seen this ape-like creature run across the road near this boggy creek and things like that. And they called it the Fouke monster in the newspapers. They, at this time, back in 1971, and in the South, not many people thought Bigfoot. It was just this big, scary ape-like creature. And so there was a would-be filmmaker by the name of Charles B. Pierce who lived in Texarkana, and he was kind of looking at the newspaper articles thinking, wow, this would make a great documentary. I could just go down to Fouke, which was, even though it was only about 20 minutes outside of that Texarkana city, it is a world away in the bottoms of the Sulphur River and just the wooded area. And so he eventually started working on that. And this is just a guy who had never made a movie. This was literally independent filmmaking, at its best, when that stuff was difficult. And it kind of transformed into this kind of docudrama. So it's more like you see witnesses reenacting the sightings or reenactments, and then you have overdubs with narration. So it actually kind of set the format of what you see on many of these cable paranormal shows. Finding Bigfoot and things where they reenact it. This was all being done in The Legend of Boggy Creek. And the accents are authentic, it wasn't Hollywood whatsoever. So it gave it this very sense of like it was happening. And I remember seeing it as a kid, and I couldn't quite understand. I was thinking, how was there a camera there while this person was having this sighting? I just couldn't quite understand that it was a reenactment. It was so convincing. And so the movie was made for $160,000. And then Charles Pierce had to go out to Hollywood basically to find somebody to do the editing and the soundtrack and all that. Distributors didn't want to have anything to do with this movie. It was just sort of laughed off. It's like, okay, it's a guy who never made a film. It's in Arkansas. It's about a Bigfoot. Haha, But he found a good team of guys that worked on this, and he put it together and began showing it in Texarkana. And there was lines around the block because, Fouke Marsh was very popular there. Obviously, the subject was, been publicized. And then he made another copy and started showing in Shreveport, Louisiana, same kind of deal, lines around the block. And then a distributor did come in and put it into the theater circuit and on drive-ins in 1973, and it played everywhere. And it was just a huge, huge thing back in the 70s, a phenomenon, really. And it made up upwards of $25 million and was later syndicated on TV. So back at that time, everybody heard of it, especially if you were into Bigfoot, or you lived in rural areas, because those people were just like, oh my God, this is, I can identify with this. So I was just one of those kids who saw it in a drive-in when I was really small. I don't even know how I remember it, but it was just such a cool movie. And uh, later on became a catalyst to influence a lot of the early guys into Bigfoot research. I mean, if you talk to Lauren Coleman and, uh, you know, many of those guys, they'll say, Legend of Boggy Creek, really uh, got me wanting to research more on this, as well as the PG film.
Yeah, I've talked to several people that are started early on, and that was one of the things they said. It was always In Search Of, and it was always the Legend of Boggy Creek that sort of got people interested. That was alive, of course, back in that era. And I will watch the movie. I've got to do that for sure.
and I must say that it has recently been remastered, because for most years it was put on VHS, but then the DVDs that existed since, like, say, the 90s are all bootlegs, and they're of terrible quality. So Pamela Pierce, which is the director Charles Pierce's daughter, got rights to the film and found a reel. I've worked with her for years trying to even find the original film reels to a digital transfer. So if you watch the remastered version, it's just amazing. I mean, the cinematography is just, outside of the Bigfoot subject, is a beautifully made, localized regional film that it just stands up when you see it in that remastered format.
You mentioned the PG film. Let's just talk about that for a second. What did you think? What was your opinion on, and has your opinion changed over the years about the PG film itself? Like, in general, the overall film and its authenticity. What do you think about that?
Well, when I can remember first seeing it, like I said, I mean, it just looks like a creature. I mean, you don't even get the impression it's a person in a suit. It looks, just like, wow, this thing is living in those woods, and this is a rare glimpse. And it was also frightening. It just looked, it's like the fear of the unknown. As I became an adult, and I try to look at things in more of a skeptical, balanced way, I can see both sides. It's like, yeah, I get it, how it's not 8 foot tall, and it's estimated to be within human parameters. And there's points where you could say it kind of looks like a person, but still the costume holds up. uh, even if it's a costume, it's difficult to tell, and of course the quality of that. But I've always, I can't say 100% I wasn't there. I can't just say, I try not to use I believe, but I definitely think there is a high level of possibility that is a creature. And of course, I've gotten to be friends with Bob Gimlin and talk to him about this over the years. And my opinion on that was that if it is a hoax, he was hoaxed as well, because he's very down to earth, authentic, and he had nothing to gain by not blowing the whistle. So I think that if it was a hoax, he had to have been hoaxed as well, which may have been genius if that even could take place. But I don't know. They've tried to recreate that suit even on television shows, and you look at it, and in 1 second you go, it's a suit. It's silly. So I still think that that's most likely a real creature.
I agree. I've talked to so many people on the show. It's like a drinking game now. So you guys get ready. When I had Jeff Meldrum on the show, and that was one of the things that I asked Dr. Meldrum, and his answer was, I've said it plenty of times on the show, forgive me guys, but he believes that's a real creature as much as he can, having not stood on the sandbar when the film was made. And I've gotten some crap because I actually did a member show, God, it was months ago. And I did it on the Hoax of the Century film, based on the book, Making Bigfoot or whatever, with I can never remember the guy's name who wrote Greg Long. Yes.
Greg Long.
I usually butcher his name on the show, so I try to I disagree with just about everything he says. So, but I post that show, and they just see the Hoax of the Century Patterson Gimlin film, and they think that I'm agreeing with it. it's the complete opposite, because I believe, although I've went back and forth like you, I wasn't there. I can't say for certain, but I am pretty sure that that's a real creature in that film, because as you said, I've never seen anything that's even come close to that, and certainly not in 1967. But it's one of those things that endures, and I think that's part of the mystery, and that's part of the thing that I love about this phenomenon is I get to have conversations with so many people like you who may see things differently than me, but we can all agree that it's a fun topic to explore. It's something that, anybody can get into, and no matter what you believe, at the end of the day, none of us really know what's going on, right? So the search goes on. I want to talk to you about, I want to shift gears, if you would, and talk a little bit about Momo. I know that's one of those things that I believe you've actually written a book about that, right?
Right. Yes.
So for those of us that aren't familiar with the Missouri Monster story, would you mind sort of giving us the background and the history on that, and how you got interested in that story?
Yeah, so MOMO is short for Missouri Monster, MO for the abbreviation for Missouri and Monster. And MOMO was a name that was given this creature by the newspapers, much like the Fouke Monster story. And it was another one that is born out of the 1970s, almost the same time period, 1971, 1972 era. And it was one where, after I wrote The Beast of Boggy Creek, I did a book called Beyond Boggy Creek, where I then talked about the history of Bigfoot all through the Deep South. The premise was that, well, the legend of Boggy Creek is super famous, but that's because it had a movie. There's all this other history going on. Well, Momo kind of fits into that, even though it's a little more north, but it was very kind of the similar case, but it was just too much to it to fit in Beyond Boggy Creek. So I decided, well, I'll just write a book on that alone. And so again, same process. I collected what there was, talked to people, went up to this little town, and which is the town of Louisiana, Missouri, if that's not confusing enough. Try writing a book where that's the town. I constantly say in Louisiana, the town, But in 1972, that summer, there were some kids who lived in this little town, which really is right next to the Mississippi River. And there's woods and cliffs and hills and rolling pastures out there. It just really has it all. And their property backs up to this big hill called Marzoff Hill that kind of looms over this little town. And these kids were out there playing, and all of a sudden they looked up and saw this big, hairy, 6 or 7 foot tall creature standing upright. And it had hair that was kind of covering its face. It was very scraggly, and it appeared to be holding what they thought was a dead dog. It looked like it had blood. It couldn't quite tell because, of course, these kids were young, 7, 10 years old. Well, they screamed and ran towards the house. Their older sister looked out the window and also saw it. And they ran inside, and then they called, she called their parents, and her dad came down. And so that kind of began the whole Momo thing, and that made newspapers. And then there was, subsequent sightings and other people who said, oh yeah, I've seen something like that. And all that, which usually plays in is once something gets some publicity, other people are like, wait, we saw something like that too. And we heard weird noises. And so this created this whole frenzy that went on, and posses of the police were searching Marzoff Hill. There were all kinds of weird stuff going on. Even people saw strange lights in the sky, and just sort of threw everything into that bucket, and it created this real concentrated year of fear, basically. And so it was just kind of a classic Bigfoot. Now, when you think about, Bigfoot in the States, you got skunk ape, Fouke monster, Sasquatch, Momo. And, if you look on the internet, there's blogs and stuff, but nobody had ever really written a book on a comprehensive story. So that's that one. And I think it's a cool one just because it's so very 1970s, and it just was a town that was just totally affected by these sightings.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things about this topic, one of many, obviously, but the differences in what people see around the country. Depending on where you're at, people have these different encounters with these things, and they see these things, and they're clearly, their physical appearance is different, the way they describe it. And I always like to ask the question. You've done a lot of research, you've written 7 books, and you've talked to a lot of people. How much of, I guess that's not a fair way to ask the question. Let me ask it this way. There's sightings everywhere. There's probably thousands of sightings that get reported every year, right? And the question always comes up from skeptics and non-believers and people that need a little bit more. If there's so many sightings across the country and literally around the world, how are these things hiding? And where is the body? That's always the question, right? But I don't even think that's a fair question to ask you, because we clearly would be speculating. But just on the sightings themselves, you mentioned earlier about the people that want the publicity, and yeah, these people saw this. Well, I saw it too. When the attention starts. I mean, how much of that do you really feel plays into some of the sightings that people report, and how many of them do you think are actually seeing what they think they see? I guess is a fair question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, we always got to be balanced and skeptical. And certainly I think a number of these are, people don't, obviously there's cases where people lie and make up stuff. And usually, I mean, I've interviewed so many people, I can usually tell the ones that are like, this ain't going in my book. I'll be like, oh, okay, whatever. And then you've got a large number of people who, they saw something, but it could be a trick of light and shadows. It could be misidentification, or in some of these cases, like, oh, there's something like that. I think I saw that. Not a real clear sighting. You narrow that down though, and there is a certain number of people who you just can't explain what they saw. There, you can, kind of eliminate all the other possibilities. Was it a bear? Were they drinking? Are they crazy? And you narrow it down. It's like, this is a very rational person. It was a pretty clear sighting. It was pretty close. Even those kids that saw Momo, I mean, I talked to Doris Harrison. The girl was a teenager at the time. She said, people laughed at me and put off. I don't even like to talk about it, but I'll tell you, I saw that thing 100%. So it really leaves only one thing. Either it was somebody perpetrating a hoax in the whole town and fooling all these other people, some of whom saw it really close. Like it came up to the door window of a car, and 2 ladies saw it and said it was an animal of some sort. Those people, that kind of leads us to that question: how in the world can people be seeing this credible, clear sightings, yet we don't have, any proof, any ultimate proof or solid proof, or however you want to word it. The only thing I can say about that is partially luck, partially that I think there's a lot fewer of these creatures than we kind of imagine. We're immersed in this Bigfoot world where there's sightings every day, everywhere. But truly, like, which ones are the, like the cream of the crop, and how often is that occurring? Where they're bulletproof sightings. I think they're fairly rare, and they must logically have some intelligence, which, they're not armadillos just wandering around. They want to stay reclusive. They're not just meandering around. And the ones that are seen are probably curious, or younger ones that, that don't have the sense to, like the older ones are probably very reclusive. They can, like other animals, they can smell us coming a mile away, hear you, sense you. They can easily avoid you. They can even avoid cameras. And I believe that because it was a study which looked at the effects of game cameras on alpha male coyotes. And those coyotes could sense those cameras and would avoid it. And this is a real scientific study with a big old long name. I can't even remember, but like, if a coyote can't avoid a camera, certainly we would presume that something like Bigfoot could. So, it's a conundrum that the longer the research goes on, the more it seems like we would have something. But it may seem impossible, but it's not improbable. And I think that, it's something that still has value as far as researching.
Yeah, I agree. And that's one of the main reasons that I started doing the show, was just to document the encounters. And I'm in North Carolina. I was born and raised in Georgia. And I wanted to start with the specific southeastern United States sightings because I was very interested in the area that I live in. And I started there, and very similar sightings across North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Then you move into Florida and it gets a little different with the skunk ape. They look a little different. They sound a little different. They smell a little different, so I got very curious about that. And then you start talking to people in this Pacific Northwest, and these things are much larger. And I too agree with you that I do believe there are people that squeak by probably on my show that probably embellish their stories. I strive not to have anybody on my show that I don't believe has had a real encounter. But it's like you said, when you have so many sightings, I agree with you. I used to think there was a lot more of these things because I was immersed in, oh my God, there's a sighting every day in every state. And then I started really diving into the research and talking to scientists and scientifically minded, critical thinking people. And I think there's a lot less of these things, like you said, than some people would even like us to believe, and some of us want to believe. And I think that ultimately that plays a huge role in why we don't have the proof, or the ultimate proof, as you said, of the body, right? But it's still a fascinating subject, man. I love to talk to people. Is there anybody that you've ever interviewed that just told you the wildest story that you've ever heard that has really stuck out to you, that you believed obviously had a real encounter?
I mean, I suppose they're all wild if you think like, I just saw this ape that walked upright through the woods or whatever the thing is. Uh, yeah, there's been some where the person has been emotionally upset. A woman back in 2014 on a Tuesday before Thanksgiving at 10 a.m. was driving from her home, which is right on the Sulphur River in on the Texas side, and driving, and she forgot something. So she turned around and she starts going the other way. And she said, there was this thing standing in the road. She said, I thought it was a kid in a Halloween costume, and but as I looked at it and it just looked at me, she said, I could see the way the hair was. I could see the skin. She said, I began to think, no, this isn't somebody in a costume. This is some kind of a thing. And it had walked out of a very heavy tree line, was kind of moving towards an open field, which presumably would have been behind the woman's car, but she turned around. So she said it just kind of looked at her and just then turned and darted really fast back into the woods. And she said, but it was only 5 feet tall, I would guess, which is why she thought it was a kid. I said, the woman was just upset. And I mean, this is a clear daylight sighting. So, you would think this is a crazy woman that just said this, but had no reason to make it up. And I had to actually, it was just pure luck that I even knew about this. And she didn't really want me to broadcast her name or do anything. She's like, I'll tell you what I saw, but it just upsets me. I'm still trying to sort of grapple with the reality. And she had heard of the Boggy Creek monster. So she kind of, had some idea and knows of Bigfoot. But anyways, I thought, well, if these things are natural creatures, they got to grow up. They don't all pop out at 8 foot tall. And she saw a juvenile. It was caught unawares. And, again, I talk, there's hardly any houses out there. And I talked to the guy who lives at the closest house, and he says, there's no kids that even live around here. And if they were, they're all in school, because that was a Tuesday at 10 a.m. before the Thanksgiving holiday. So there's those where somebody else would see this lady and probably think she's nuts, but I'm listening to her in a different way. And I realized she's not making this up. And, I think back to the other point real quick. I think it's okay to say that there's not that many sightings. I think that gives us some better credibility. The fact, and it's fun, and we want to like, wow, there's just all these sightings and stuff, but it starts to stack up to where it's like, okay, they're running amok. You go to the state park and every weekend, and there's 2 or 3 of them. That begins to sound impossible. But if you say, they're so rare and so reclusive, like a cougar. I mean, go in the woods and try to just see a cougar or a panther. Even a bear, it's difficult. I mean, and you presume there's so many more bear. There could be 30,000 bears in some of the northern states. Well, there could be a population of 200 or 300 Bigfoot and survive, which makes them so rare that the experience is like winning the lottery, and also makes it sound like that can be reality. There's so few of them, very, very hard to get a body, to get one on film, all of that.
And that's a good point that you make. I think shows like mine even have probably contributed to that in some ways, because it's an encounter show and we have people on shows like this, and I interview people and they're going through their encounters and they've had these experiences. And I think it's very important that they share them, but I think it almost desensitizes people in a way. It's like, oh, another encounter, another sighting, they're everywhere. And I think it's very important to remember very few people ever come on my show and want any kind of recognition. I mean, it takes me sometimes pulling them tooth and nail to get them on and share their encounter on the show, because they don't want people to know. They don't want to tell and be ridiculed and be called names and things like that. So, and I think I say it often, that in of itself to me lends credibility. If there's somebody who's sending me pictures and blob squatches and videos with nothing on them and things like that, and they've seen just about everything under the sun. Oh, I've seen that. Oh, I've seen that. Yeah, I tend to, I tend to say, I never say that their experiences aren't valid. They're their experiences, but it's always a red flag to me when people start saying, yeah, I've had multiple encounters. It's like, if you see one of these things one time, you've hit the lottery. And to have multiple encounters over multiple years in multiple states gets a little out there for me. But I never exclude it on the show, because I put it out there for people to make up their own mind, right?
Yeah, and you can, because there's certainly factors that we may not understand. I've often thought, are there certain people that can see things or have the propensity or the luck to see things that others don't? I'm like, I've been in the same woods years and years. One of the guys that was prominent in Legend of Boggy Creek, Smoky Crabtree, his son had a very dramatic sighting in 1965, and he spent the rest of his life wanting to see one himself, just for curiosity and to prove to people that his son wasn't making it up. He was an extremely good woodsman and spent a lot of time. He never had, a solid sighting his whole life. And, you think, well, you just do your best to vet the people as you can, and you let them on. And of course, it makes it seem like there's sightings all the time, but some of these people are talking about a sighting they had 1965, and then, yes, I saw something earlier this year, but they're so spaced out that it, in the condensed form of a show that's weekly, but you got to think of the miles and miles of forestry, the numbers of days and minutes and years. And if you start spreading those out, they are a lot more infrequent. And then if you get rid of the ones where people go, well, I'm pretty sure I saw one, if you just get the ironclad ones, I think, again, the cream at the crop says, there's some really, really good ones here we can't dismiss, but it's not so many that it seems wild.
Yeah, and I've had the same experience over and over. And it's a good point that you made about some people are more open to seeing things, I think. And I don't know if they're special in some way or they're just more in tune with what's going on. And I've had conversations recently I do a paranormal show. I do the Paranormal Odyssey podcast as well. And I have people over there that have a lot of UFO experiences. And I've asked a couple of them recently, some of the UFO people, or the people who have encounters or experiences with the UFOs, tend to have multiple encounters. I've seen a UFO, but it was one time when I was 16. I'm 46 now. That's a long time ago. And the answer across the board with people who have researched this a ton of times, I had Stan Gordon over there recently, and he's investigated UFOs and Bigfoot for 62 years. He's
Yeah,
never seen a UFO and he's never seen a Bigfoot.
right.
And one of the things Stan said is, I think people are more open to those types of experiences, particularly with UFOs. And that's what I've been getting across the board. And I've asked a couple of people that have seen multiple UFOs, and it's sometimes as simple as I look up and I'm like, holy shit, that makes sense. Because how many people really go outside day or night and spend any time just looking up at the sky? Sure, people do. It's a hobby for some people, but in general, out of the 300 million people in the United States, very few people do that. But the ones who do on a regular basis, and a lot of the times, they're the ones that are taking pictures of UFOs, they're getting videos, and they're having personal experiences. Same thing in the woods. A lot of people go out in the woods. I live in the woods, and I can go hiking on my property and miss things and get turned around because I'm not paying attention. So there's tons of ways, I think, to miss these things. And I think that people who end up having the encounters are probably a little bit more in tune. I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, I did some training with some Marines once, like a survive and evade. And those guys showed me some simple things, like they weren't even really in a ghillie suit or anything. I was looking right at some, and I didn't see them. And they knew how to break up their form. And they also said, we don't move. You tend to want to move when somebody looks, you tend to want to hide or move. We don't move. And your eye just totally misses them. I was like, wow, it's amazing. It's like, and animals and things in the woods just have miraculous, capabilities. So it would be very easy for a creature like this that is designed to be camouflaged and to stay, away. It would be very easy for them just to disappear into the woods, which doesn't mean they disappeared. They just simply, blended back into the forestry, and you don't see them anymore.
Yeah, it's a good point you make too. And I don't want to get painted into a corner talking about the woo of Bigfoot, but let's talk about just that for a second. How do you rationalize? And I know you've probably had some wild stories. I've had tons of wild stories that people have told me on and off the air about experiences that do not make sense to me in conjunction with and in correlation with Bigfoot sightings. Les Stroud was on last week's show, and Les has had some really interesting mind speak type encounters with Bigfoot. And I don't know what to make of that. I really don't. And so you've talked to a ton of people, and I'm sure you probably heard some of those stories. How do you deal with, or how do you compartmentalize those types of encounters? I don't know if you're in the flesh and blood camp or what camp you're in, but how do you reconcile those kind of encounters where it seems like this thing may be a little bit more than a really smart ape in the woods?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly have to look at that. And as somebody who I just research and I tell the story, I'm not necessarily know all the answers. I have to kind of evaluate everything. I think just for me, we haven't really ruled out that it's not a flesh and blood creature. And it seems so much of a terrestrial nature. Some people go, it looked kind of like an ape, or it looks so human. It's so much that it could fit right into the bushy branches of hominids, and looks so much like a combination between us. So much, it just, I don't know. Gray aliens just look weird. That's like, that doesn't look like it's from Earth. Bigfoot does. And I think, again, we underestimate the capabilities of animals. There is some miraculous thing. Look at what an octopus can do. Even the intelligence of that thing. It's so much of a sentient kind of creature that if Bigfoot is a hominid that's got any wherewithal or intelligence that even is part of what we can do, it would be that much more effective than just your average animal. And again, I look at these Marines, I'm like, they're not supernatural, but dude, those guys could disappear right in front of your eyes. One guy, he's like, he had no camouflage. He literally had like a stick sticking up out of his hat. I was like, what is that? He says, It breaks up the form. When your eye goes across me, you're looking, it's like a computer trying to put shapes together. There's a human form, bear, I just passed right by him. So, everything in nature is designed, that the stripes of a tiger, they're not just there so we can go, oh, look at that thing in the zoo. That is the flora and fauna of the combination of these animals that is so effective, and why, well, they generally survive till we just get rid of their whole environment or something. But so with the woo stuff, it's like, well, I can't rule that out. I can't say that Les Stroud hasn't had a mind speak. Only Les knows that. There's bizarre things in this world, but I just kind of operate on the ground level. And again, usually when I have people telling me about a lot of extraordinary stuff or communicating with Sasquatch in, what language? Spanish. I've gotten all kinds of, well, I just generally just take reports by hunters and people who just saw them. So these are the exception, but they just tend to pile on a lot. Oh, I also saw a UFO, and I also saw, there's a ghost standing next to me. It's like, oh, it just like starts to be like, I don't know, man. It just seems like too much to swallow. And now you can also communicate in various languages with Bigfoot. I don't know. So I never want to say that I know everything, but I try to there's plenty of regular sightings without me dealing with those.
Yeah, and it sort of comes with the territory when you're doing a show like this, because I get tons of people that want to share their encounters, and I listen to every single one of them. And I've said it plenty of times on the show, for every show you hear that's an hour long and somebody's on talking about, I probably talk to 10 people outside of the show, and they never make it on the show for various reasons. But it's always fascinated me, and I've made it a point never to exclude anything like that on the show, because I think it's important. I think valid sightings and weird things that happen, particularly with habituation sites, a lot of times people have lights and they see craft and other things, and I don't know if it's related or not, but they're seeing it. So I put it out there and let people share their encounters just as they are. I know I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to move into a couple of other things. I want to talk a little bit about other cryptids. That's a very interesting subject to me. I've talked to people who have had Bigfoot encounters who have also seen Chupacabra. I've had people on the show who have had Bigfoot encounters, and they've seen literally little green men that look like Native American First Nations people in the woods. What you've experienced and talked to people with other cryptid encounters, what else have you taken a look at, and what else are you hearing that people are seeing? And what are your thoughts on just other cryptids in general outside of Bigfoot?
Well, I think Bigfoot is the number one, like most possible to be discovered in terms of cryptids. I think everything else starts, becoming a little bit more of a stretch, not, by some degrees. I've kind of looked into just generally a little bit of everything, and some of those in depth. Like my second book was about the lizard man case from Bishopville, South Carolina, not far from you. And, I was fascinated by that, because you basically have people saying they saw this sort of creature from the Black Lagoon-esque looking thing, like in 1988. And again, the whole town was in this media frenzy over these sightings. And some of the witnesses really were frightened and had frightening encounters with this reptilian thing that walked on two legs, very anthropomorphic, human-like, not so much like it's like a dinosaur thing. The papers would draw these things that look silly, but if you listen to the witnesses, they were describing something that was much more human-like yet reptilian. So, I don't begin to know the answers as to what that is. And I know when you get to reptilians, there's sort of my cryptozoological view, and then there's or study, and then you can go a long way with that. But I was recently looking into a case in Texas of this it was kind of a weird case where people said this thing was walking through their town and it had a tail and cloven hooves and all this. But within that, some guy said, well, I don't know about that, but I saw something close in that proximity back in the 1980s. And he said it was on the Brazos River. And he said, me and my friend were out there doing trot lines, and I looked up and it looked like kind of like an alligator walking on two legs coming at us. Big, tall as a person, not a real long snout, but because I couldn't tell if it had a tail. All I know was I saw this reptilian looking thing coming out of the shallows of that river coming towards us. We put a spotlight right on it. He said, we didn't waste any time. We just started that boat and took off. It was so scary. And I'm talking to this guy, and he is just like many of your, encounter witnesses. They just a person who was there and doesn't have an explanation, but I know he saw it. Chupacabra, there's all that. I'm in Texas, so there's the whole four-legged, mangy, canid kind of chupacabra, and then that's kind of confusing because the original sightings were in Latin America of a sort of more bipedal, smaller, scaly looking creature. But those are fascinating. And, I've looked in some lake monsters, and I've had reports of a pilot captured this big, huge something in a river in Louisiana, which I still can't quite explain. And other people had seen this sort of a river monster kind of a thing in that area. So that was fun to look into. Mothman, I participated in some research and a documentary on that subject. And that, of course, again, you start getting more into kind of this sort of junction of paranormal meets cryptid. And then, just on and on from there with various goat men sightings. I mean, I've had a little bit of everything. And I think it's all cool because, again, it goes back to when I was a kid. It's like people seeing monsters in the woods. It's just a cool subject.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating the things that people see, again, it's their experience, right? And it sort of starts to blur the lines, like you said, for me, between cryptozoology and the paranormal and interdimensional beings. And it's just a whole can of worms and a rabbit hole that you can go down any day of the week. And I find it all fascinating, man. I love to have the stories on the show. I love to hear people's encounters and understand what they're seeing. Mothman, it has always interested me. And I think that's probably one of the most fascinating things. Every time I watch Jeepers Creepers, we're coming up on Halloween, it's one of my favorite Halloween movies to watch during the season. And I think this is basically what people are saying they're seeing when they see Mothman, right? And here it is on the silver screen, or in my case now on the television. And I'm thinking, that is crazy that people are seeing that. But there are so many credible people who swear up and down that they have seen this large human-like creature with wings flying over them and landing on things. It's crazy, man. It's a wonderful world, man.
That's right. And, then it's just fun to go to the places. I've been up there to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, into the TNT area where it was originally seen and where the stories emanated from. And, even if I don't see the Mothman or anything, just to go to these places and just sort of like, wow, this is where all this started, right here with two couples that had no idea this would become a story that people are talking about, books and movies. And it's a spooky place, dude. That place has got a really ominous vibe. And so, yeah, you can look at some of these places and say, maybe it's the place, I don't know. There's so many of those aspects where you could just speculate and go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, you start talking like Skinwalker Ranch, all the wild things that happen on Skinwalker Ranch, and you're thinking it's got to be the land. At least that's my opinion about Skinwalker. All the crazy things that go on and people see these things, it seems to be connected with the land itself. And it's like that with a lot of ghost cases and some of the ghost stories that people tell me that they have. It's connected to the land in a lot of places. let's talk a little bit about, have you ever had an encounter with anything that you can't explain in all these dealings? Is there anything that you've experienced that you've come away scratching your head and saying, I just really don't know what that was?
Yeah, there's been a handful of times where, um, I haven't had any one definitive sighting where I was, clear daylight, I saw something, but there's been a couple of occasions in particular with Bigfoot where something was howling. I heard this multiple times of a howl that I'm not sure what the creature was. And it sounded much like what you hear as purported Bigfoot howls. This thing had followed us down a meandering bayou channel and howled at me and another guy right there. I used a flashlight, ran down this hill, tried to see it, but it just poof, it ran and howled again 50 yards away in just a millisecond. Once in uh, Florida in the Colorado National Forest, kind of a similar thing where some heavy thing was just out of sight and evading me, and no qualms about running after it because I'm like, I'll take my chances. And then once in the Boggy Creek area, I saw what, this was in daylight. We were in an area where there's cypress trees, and we happened to be looking there because it was right. You could see these in the Monster Quest episode where they do the Swamp Stalker. I just happened to be looking. I saw something that caught my eye like a shadow, which kind of immediately I thought it's something walking upright, but I couldn't even tell. Right after that, I saw some kind of form move about 20 yards behind that across. It was reddish in color, which I'm like, I couldn't quite say, I can't even honestly say it was a Bigfoot, but it was bizarre because only about 2 hours before we were down at a convenience store in town. And one of the locals said, I saw some kind of ape-like thing run across the road right in front of my truck. He goes, it was reddish like an orangutan. Now I've heard that, and you get different color. And then 2 hours later, I saw some red thing, but it just wasn't clear enough for me to sit here and say I saw a Bigfoot. It was just weird. And it was a place where you can't get to it we couldn't go over there because there's a channel between us with alligators in it. So I wasn't going to wade over there, and didn't have a boat, but you can't get over there. There's no how. I mean, it's just out in the bottoms of Sulphur River. Um, and there's been other noise type things. I once saw a ghost when I was in high school. So, check that off the box. So yeah, a number of weird things, but unfortunately no like definitive cryptid sighting.
Well, I definitely appreciate you sharing that. So, what do you have going on now? What do you got going on as far as projects? You got appearances coming up? Are you working on any new books? Are you still doing the small town monsters thing?
Yeah. I've been narrating their films. We just had one come out on September 14th, the Skinwalker Howl of the Rougarou, in which I'm the narrator of that, which I am in most of their monster documentaries. And that one we explore legends mainly of werewolf-like creatures in Louisiana and the Cajun culture. And let's see, I'm always kind of working on a book or kind of collecting stuff, trying to see what's next as far as that. So starting to get too many ideas. I need to focus and figure it out. I released 2 books last year, so it's like I took a little breather on that, just collecting. I got a lot of appearances that have come up that, I like to do these Bigfoot conferences, get out there, network, meet people, and now that COVID's kind of, I don't know if COVID let up, but people just got fed up and events are happening. So, September, October is always just busy with that. And I love those things because you're around like-minded people, and I always get great contacts with witnesses and things that may later appear in the books. Beyond that, yeah, there's a documentary that's being shot that they contacted me about today with kind of a major network. So maybe that. And then otherwise, looking forward to the fall where I can actually get out into the woods and just not necessarily research, just get out in the woods and enjoy the great outdoors and relax a little bit and kind of get off the grid.
Where's the best place for people to find you and people to find your books? I'd love to send the audience over to pick up some of your books, man. I think they should get them all.
I think they should. Yeah, well, lyleblackburn.com has all the info that you need, and the list of books and the links, and with the Small Town Monsters movies I've been involved in and other things. And I have an online store that you can get autographed copies if you just click the store link there. Or, of course, you can get all my books on Amazon. They're all on there. And the Small Town Monsters movies, or wherever finer movies are streamed, Amazon Video and all that. Just go to Amazon Video and search Lyle Blackburn. You can see all those great movies. But yeah, I encourage people to check it out. And, I always say books are the great resource. I mean, the internet's great and all, but, this is where I can put together and take the time to really sift out the stories behind some of the most famous Bigfoot cases, Momo, the Boggy Creek Monster, Southern Bigfoot, all of that stuff.
Awesome. And I will link to all of that stuff in the show notes, folks. I definitely suggest you go over and check it out. Lyle Blackburn, thanks so much for your time, man. I've had a blast talking to you tonight.
Absolutely. Great interview. I appreciate it.
All right. Oh, that was awesome, man. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
I have reached out to Seth Breedlove like 47 times and stalked him on. I've been trying to get him on the show to talk about. I saw him release the movies and I was like, I got to get him on to talk about his movies. But I guess he's at the point he doesn't really have to do publicity anymore. It just kind of happens for him. So
yeah, he is. So every time I turn around, I don't even know how that guy is putting out so many series and movies now. I mean, all he does is, I think that's why he lets me be involved, because I'll talk about it on shows.
Definitely appreciate it, man. I've been looking, there's a few people that I've really wanted to get a hold of and get on the show, and you've definitely been on the short list for a long time. So I definitely appreciate you coming on. I've really, really enjoyed it. Where are you going to be at any conferences coming up well, you probably don't get out to the East Coast much, do you? You're in Texas.
Well, I do them all over, but the next thing is the Texas Bigfoot Conference. Let's see, I did the Gatlinburg one. I got Memphis, but that's not very east.
So you were at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference.
I was the year before. I was in 2020, actually. They still had it. So summer of 2020, I did that conference in this. It was now there's two of them. It's confusing. There's the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot. They had another one, but I know there's a Bigfoot conference in North Carolina, I think, that I want to do. But yeah, I do those. It just depends,
Yeah, I was at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference this year. It was actually the first Bigfoot conference I've ever been to. And I kind of like to check it out. And I'm definitely going back. I'm going to have a table there for the show next year. So
yeah,
it was a really well done conference. I was impressed. It's where I met Matt Pruitt. Matt and I become pretty good friends.
Matt's he's a good buddy. He's a great guy.
I was filming a television show last week, and it's going to be out sometime probably next year. But it was funny. They had actually talked to Matt about possibly being on the show, and I called him because I was up near. He's originally from Georgia, and I was up near where he was used to live. Of course, he's in Tennessee now. And I called him up and I was like, hey man, can you come down to the Bigfoot conference and, or the Bigfoot museum and film a scene with me? And he was like, I'd love to, but I got to work. Yeah, he's an awesome guy. He's definitely been a great resource and a great buddy in the Bigfoot world. So you don't get much better than that.
Yeah. He's good people. There's some real good, you see all the fighting, but all the dudes I know or hang with, it's all great times and good stuff,
I have the podcasting world can be, and the Bigfoot community can be a little, there's definitely an underbelly to that. I'll just put it that way. There's definitely an underbelly.
Yeah, absolutely. With anything, you get groups of people together, somebody's got a problem,
Usually the way it works. Well, man, I want to be respectful of your time. I'll let you get off of here, but let's definitely stay in touch, and I'll probably put the show out. Oh God, I don't know. I'm probably a month and a half behind on getting shows. I've got about 8 or 9 interviews. I was working on Carter Bouchard. I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago, and I said, after Les Stroud, I'm going to put out your show and talk about your new book, because he just wrote Sasquatch Evidence of an Enigma 2.
Yeah.
So I'm working on his show. It'll be out this Friday, but I'll definitely I'll shoot you a message, and if you wouldn't mind sharing it when it comes out on your social media and stuff, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I knew of your show. I see it across my radar. So when I saw, I was like, yeah, I knew that was a good one, and I've been wanting to do it too. So that worked out.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I reached out to Amy Boo, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks ago, and she's been having some help. Do you know Amy?
Yeah, very, very well.
Okay. Yeah, I'd reached out to Amy, and this is probably about a month ago, and she's like, I just hit her up on Facebook Messenger, and I was like, hey, I do this weekly podcast, and I'd really like to have you on. She was like, oh my God, I love your show. And I was like, holy shit, Amy Boo listens to my show. What?
Yeah.
That's really cool. Well, I really do appreciate it, man. And like I said, I'll shoot you the link when I get everything put together, and we'll go from there.
All right. Sounds good. We'll publicize.
Awesome. Take care, man.
All right. See you.
Bye-bye.